Welcome to this journey through one of the most extraordinary gambles in military history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time when you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing what places and at what times of day or night these stories reach you. Commander Joseph Rochefort pulled a crumpled $5 bill from his pocket and slapped it on the desk between himself and Captain Edwin Layton on May 8, 1942. $5. In 1942, that was a week's pay for an enlisted sailor. It was groceries for a family. It was the price of seeing 3 movies and having dinner afterward. And it was everything Rochefort was willing to risk on a bet that could save or lose the Pacific War. "I will prove that AF is Midway Atoll," Rochefort said. His voice was hoarse from too many cigarettes and not enough sleep. "Give me 48 hours. If I am wrong, this $5 is yours. If I am right, you buy me a bottle of bourbon, and we convince Admiral Nimitz to send every carrier we have left straight into the biggest ambush in naval history." Layton stared at the money. He and Rochefort had been friends for 20 years, had studied Japanese together in Tokyo, had drunk sake in dive bars in Yokohama, and argued about no theater and baseball until dawn. Layton knew that when Rochefort made a bet, he was not gambling. He was stating a fact he could not yet prove, but believed with religious certainty. "And if you are wrong," Layton said quietly, "and we send our carriers to Midway based on your intelligence, and the Japanese hit us somewhere else? What happens then, Joe?" Rochefort did not hesitate. "Then thousands of men die. Hawaii falls. The war in the Pacific is over, and I will spend the rest of my life knowing I killed them." The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of ventilation fans trying and failing to cool the basement room where they sat. This was Station Hypo, the Navy's cryptanalysis unit at Pearl Harbor, located in the basement of the administration building, because cryptanalysts needed isolation and secrecy and concrete walls thick enough to block radio interference. The room smelled of stale coffee, cigarette smoke, and sweat. It was crowded with desks covered in worksheets filled with 5-digit code groups, mechanical calculators that clattered when you cranked the handles, and ashtrays overflowing with cigarette butts that no one had emptied in days. Rochefort had been working in this basement for 16 months, ever since he had arrived in January 1941 to take command of Station Hypo. He was 41 years old, a Navy officer who had started as an enlisted man with barely a high school education and worked his way to commander through brains and stubbornness and a complete disregard for military protocol. He wore a smoking jacket to work because it was comfortable, which violated every regulation in the book. He called superior officers idiots when they were wrong, which made him enemies. He worked 20-hour shifts and expected his team to do the same, which made him feared. And he broke Japanese codes better than anyone else in the Navy, which made him indispensable. But on December 7th, 1941, none of that had mattered. Rochefort had been in this same basement when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, listening through headphones to Japanese radio transmissions he could intercept but not decode, hearing the sounds of war coming through the walls as bombs fell and ships burned. He had walked upstairs after the attack and seen Battleship Row transformed into hell. The USS Arizona blown apart, with more than 1,000 men trapped inside. The USS Oklahoma capsized with sailors pounding on the hull, screaming to be rescued. The USS California sinking. the USS West Virginia, on fire. 8 battleships destroyed or crippled in less than 2 hours. Rochefort had stood on the dock and watched men die, and he had understood that this was his failure. His job was to read Japanese communications and predict Japanese moves. He had failed. The intelligence officer who was supposed to prevent surprise attacks had been surprised. That night, Rochefort had sat alone in the basement and made a decision. He would not fail again. He would break the Japanese codes. He would read their messages. He would know their plans before they executed them. And he would do whatever it took, break whatever rules necessary, sacrifice whatever he had to sacrifice, to make sure December 7th never happened again. By May of 1942, Station Hypo had made progress that bordered on miraculous. The Japanese Navy used a cipher system called JN-25, one of the most complex codes ever created. It combined substitution, transposition, and numerical additives that changed regularly, creating messages that appeared to be random strings of numbers impossible to decode without the key. Breaking it required not just mathematical genius, but linguistic intuition and an understanding of Japanese military culture and procedures. Rochefort had handpicked his team for exactly those skills. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, a math prodigy who could see patterns in chaos; Ensign Joseph Finnegan, who spoke Japanese like a native and understood the cultural context behind military terminology; Jasper Holmes, a former submarine commander who thought like a Japanese fleet admiral; and dozens of others, brilliant odd men who worked in shifts around the clock, sleeping on cots in side rooms, living on black coffee and determination. By April 1942, they were reading 30 to 40% of intercepted Japanese messages. It was not perfect. It left huge gaps. But it was enough to start seeing Japanese intentions forming like shadows through fog, and what Rochefort was seeing terrified him. The Japanese were planning something massive. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, was personally commanding the operation. Multiple carrier divisions were being assembled. Transport ships were being loaded. Supply lines were being extended. It would be the largest Japanese naval operation since Pearl Harbor, possibly larger. And it was aimed at a target the Japanese designated in their messages as AF. The critical question was simple. What was AF? OP-20G, the Navy's Central Cryptanalysis Unit in Washington, run by Commander John Redman, believed AF was the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, or possibly Hawaii itself, or maybe even the west coast of the United States. They had analyzed the same intercepts Rochefort had and reached completely different conclusions. They thought Rochefort was seeing patterns where none existed, jumping to conclusions based on incomplete data, letting his imagination run away with logic. Rochefort believed AF was Midway Atoll, a tiny pair of islands 1,400 miles northwest of Hawaii. Strategically, Midway was critical. It sat at the outer edge of the defensive perimeter protecting Hawaii. If Japan captured Midway, they could use it as a base to bomb Hawaii and force the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle that might end the war. But Rochefort's evidence was circumstantial. The code groups for AF appeared in contexts that suggested a central Pacific location. Japanese messages referenced coral atolls and seaplane bases, which fit Midway. Traffic analysis showed Japanese carriers moving toward the Central Pacific rather than north toward the Aleutians. But none of it was definitive. None of it was proof. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, needed certainty. After Pearl Harbor, he could not afford another surprise. If Rochefort was right, Nimitz could position his 3 remaining carriers near Midway and ambush the Japanese fleet. But if Rochefort was wrong, if the Japanese attacked somewhere else while the American carriers were at Midway, the consequences would be catastrophic. Hawaii might fall. The entire Pacific could be lost. The war might be over. That was the context when Rochefort slapped $5 on the desk and made his bet. Leighton picked up the money and held it to the light, as if checking whether it was counterfeit. "How are you going to prove it, Joe?" "You cannot break enough of the code to read operational orders. The Japanese are not going to broadcast their target in plain language." "So how?" Rochefort smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a man about to break every rule in the book and bet thousands of lives on his own cleverness. "We are going to trick them into telling us," he said. The plan was simple, audacious, and completely unauthorized. Rochefort would contact the garrison at Midway through secure channels and instruct them to send an unencrypted radio message reporting a fake equipment failure. The message would say that Midway's water desalination plant had broken down and the atoll was experiencing a freshwater shortage. It would be broadcast on standard naval frequencies that the Japanese were known to monitor. If the Japanese intercepted the message and relayed it to their forces using the AF designation, then the trap would prove that AF meant Midway. Leighton thought about it for exactly 10 seconds. Then he picked up the phone and called Admiral Nimitz. 30 minutes later, Rochefort was standing in Nimitz's office, explaining the plan to the only man whose permission mattered. Nimitz listened without interrupting. He was a careful, methodical officer who preferred evidence over intuition, facts over guesses. But he also understood that in war, sometimes you had to take risks based on incomplete information. The question was whether this was a calculated risk or a reckless gamble. "If the Japanese realize they are being tricked," Nimitz said, "they might change their plans. They might change their codes. We could lose our ability to read their communications at the worst possible moment." "Yes, sir," Rochefort replied. "But if we do nothing, if we wait for more evidence, by the time we have certainty, it will be too late to position our carriers for an ambush. The Japanese will hit us, and we will be reacting instead of anticipating. We will be back where we were on December 7th. Nimitz looked out the window at Pearl Harbor, where salvage crews were still working to raise sunken ships 6 months after the attack. Then he looked back at Rochefort and nodded. "Do it," he said. "But if you are wrong, Commander, do not expect me to protect you from the consequences." Rochefort sent the instructions to Midway through encrypted channels. On May 10th, 1942, Midway broadcast an unencrypted message reporting that their desalination equipment had malfunctioned and they were short on fresh water. The message went out on frequencies the Japanese monitored daily. Then Rochefort and his team waited. 48 hours passed. Station Hypo intercepted dozens of Japanese transmissions, and Rochefort's team sorted through them code group by code group, looking for any reference to water or Midway, or anything that might confirm the trap had worked. Rochefort did not sleep. He sat at his desk chain, smoking Lucky Strikes, drinking cup after cup of black coffee that had been sitting on the hot plate so long it tasted like battery acid, staring at worksheets until the numbers blurred into abstract patterns. On May 13th, at 3:15 in the afternoon, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer ran into Rochefort's office, waving a decoded message like it was a winning lottery ticket. The Japanese had taken the bait. A transmission from Japanese naval intelligence to operational forces reported that AF was experiencing freshwater shortages, and supply ships would need to bring additional water for garrison forces after the invasion. Rochefort read the message 3 times to make sure he was not hallucinating from exhaustion. Then he walked to Layton's office, slapped the decoded message on the desk, and held out his hand. "You owe me $5 and a bottle of bourbon," he said. "AF is Midway. The Japanese will attack in late May or early June with their entire carrier force. We have maybe 3 weeks to prepare." Layton read the message. Then he pulled out his wallet, extracted a $5 bill, and handed it to Rochefort. "Go tell Nimitz," he said, "and God help us if you are still somehow wrong." Rochefort walked to Nimitz's office and laid out the evidence. Nimitz listened, asked sharp questions, examined the decoded messages, and then made the decision that would determine the outcome of the Pacific War. He ordered the carriers USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown to prepare for immediate deployment to Midway. The Yorktown had been badly damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea 2 weeks earlier and was still being repaired at Pearl Harbor. Nimitz gave the repair crews 72 hours to make her seaworthy, which was not enough time for proper repairs, but would have to do. Then Nimitz sent a message to Washington informing Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, of his decision. And that was when everything started to fall apart. Commander John Redman in Washington erupted. He sent messages to King insisting that Rochefort was wrong, that AF was not Midway, that Station Hypo had misinterpreted the intercepts, that committing all 3 carriers to the Central Pacific based on unconfirmed intelligence was reckless and dangerous. Redman suggested that Rochefort was a glory hound trying to take credit for intelligence work that belonged to OP-20G, that he was uncooperative and insubordinate, that he was running unauthorized operations without clearance from Washington. Admiral King read Redman's messages and was persuaded. King did not like Rochefort. He thought Pacific intelligence should be centralized in Washington under his direct control, not scattered across field stations run by independent-minded commanders who bypassed the chain of command. King sent Nimitz a message questioning the intelligence and recommending caution. The message stopped just short of being a direct order to cancel the carrier deployment. Nimitz was now caught between his intelligence officer at Pearl Harbor and his superior in Washington. He had to decide whether to trust Rochefort's analysis or defer to Redman's skepticism. And he had to make that decision knowing that if he was wrong, thousands of men would die and the war might be lost. And then, on May 26, 1942, 72 hours before the carriers were scheduled to depart for Midway, the Japanese changed their code additives. Overnight, every partially decoded message became gibberish. The intercepts Station Hypo had been reading for weeks were suddenly unreadable. Rochefort's team scrambled to recover the new additives, working nonstop, but progress was agonizingly slow. Within hours, doubt began to spread. What if the water trap had been a fluke? What if AF was not Midway after all? What if Rochefort had led Nimitz into a catastrophic mistake based on incomplete intelligence and a clever trick that proved nothing? Rochefort sat alone in his office at 2 a.m. on May 27th, smoking his 100th cigarette of the day, and realized he was terrified. Not of dying, not of losing his career, but of being wrong, of sending 3,000 sailors and airmen to their deaths because he had been too confident, too certain, too willing to bet everything on his own analysis. He thought about Lieutenant Junior Grade William Price, a 23-year-old codebreaker on his team who had just gotten married 3 months before Pearl Harbor. Price's wife was pregnant. Price was scheduled to deploy on the Yorktown as a liaison officer to help interpret Japanese communications during the battle. If Rochefort was wrong, Price would die. The baby would grow up without a father, and it would be Rochefort's fault. He thought about the $5 bill in his pocket, the one Leighton had given him after the water trap worked. He pulled it out and looked at it. $5. The price of being right. What was the price of being wrong? Lieutenant Junior Grade William Price stood on the flight deck of the USS Yorktown on the morning of May 28, 1942, watching welders repair the massive hole in the deck where a Japanese bomb had punched through during the Battle of the Coral Sea 3 weeks earlier. The hole was 20 feet across and went down 3 decks. You could see straight through the ship to the ocean below. The welders were working around the clock, trying to patch it with steel plates, but everyone knew the repairs were temporary. The Yorktown should have spent months in dry dock. Instead, Admiral Nimitz had given the repair crews 72 hours to make her seaworthy enough to fight. Price was 23 years old. He had been married to Sarah for 4 months. She was pregnant, due in December, and Price had promised her he would be home for the birth. But now he was standing on a wounded carrier preparing to sail into battle based on intelligence he had helped decode, and he was terrified that the intelligence was wrong. Price worked at Station Hypo as a junior cryptanalyst under Commander Rochefort. He was not brilliant like Dyer, or fluent in Japanese like Finnegan, but he was methodical and careful, and good at spotting patterns in code groups that others missed. He had been one of the team members who worked on the AF intercepts, cross-referencing Japanese message traffic against geographic code groups, building the case that AF meant Midway. And 3 days ago, Rochefort had told him he was being temporarily assigned to the Yorktown as a liaison officer to help interpret Japanese communications during the upcoming battle. If there was a battle, if Rochefort was right, if AF really was Midway, and not somewhere else. Price had spent the last 72 hours alternating between confidence and doubt. He had seen the decoded message about AF having freshwater problems. He knew the water trap had worked. But he had also seen how much of the Japanese code they still could not read, how many gaps remained in their understanding, how much they were guessing based on incomplete information. And now the Japanese had changed their additives, and Station Hypo was partially blind again, struggling to recover the new keys. What if they were wrong? What if the Japanese hit Pearl Harbor while the carriers were at Midway? What if Sarah became a widow before she became a mother? A chief petty officer walked up beside Price and looked down at the hole in the deck. "You know what the boys are calling this ship?" the chief said. The chief was in his 40s, a career Navy man with 20 years of service and a face weathered by salt spray and sun. "They are calling her the Forlorn Hope." "You know what that means?" Price shook his head. "It is an old military term," the chief said. "It means the soldiers who are sent on a suicide mission, the ones who go first, knowing they probably will not come back. That is what we are, son. Admiral Nimitz is betting everything on Commander Rochefort's intelligence. If Rochefort is right, we ambush the Japanese and maybe turn this war around. If Rochefort is wrong, we sail to Midway, the Japanese hit us somewhere else, and Hawaii falls. Either way, we are the bet. We are the chips Nimitz is pushing into the center of the table. The chief walked away, leaving Price standing on the damaged flight deck, feeling the weight of those words settle onto his shoulders like a physical burden. In the basement of the administration building at Pearl Harbor, Rochefort was living through his own version of hell. The code change on May 26th had thrown Station Hypo into chaos. Every partially decoded message had become unreadable overnight. The team was working nonstop to recover the new additives, but progress was agonizingly slow. They had managed to restore maybe 15% of their previous reading ability, but that left huge gaps in coverage at the worst possible time. Rochefort had not slept in 60 hours. He sat at his desk in his smoking jacket, surrounded by ashtrays overflowing with cigarette butts, drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring at worksheets covered in numbers that seemed to mock him with their incompleteness. His eyes burned. His hands shook. His head throbbed with a migraine that felt like someone was driving nails through his skull. But he could not stop. He could not rest. 3 carriers and 3,000 men were sailing to Midway based on his analysis. And if he was wrong, their deaths would be his fault. Lieutenant Commander Dyer walked into Rochefort's office at 4 a.m. on May 29th, carrying a fresh pot of coffee and a decoded message. "We have a problem," Dyer said. Rochefort looked up. His vision was blurry from exhaustion. What kind of problem? Dyer handed him the message. It was a partially decoded Japanese transmission from May 28th. Most of the code groups were still unreadable, but enough had been recovered to reveal a troubling detail. The Japanese were changing their operational schedule. The attack on AF, which had been planned for early June, might be delayed, or moved or canceled. The message was too fragmented to know for sure, but the possibility that the entire operation might change was real. If the Japanese delay the attack, Dyer said, or if they change the target, our carriers will be sitting at Midway with nothing to shoot at. And if the Japanese hit us somewhere else, while our carriers are out of position, we lose. Everything. The whole war. Rochefort read the message 3 times, forcing his exhausted brain to process the implications. Then he stood up, walked to the map of the Pacific that covered one wall of his office, and stared at it. The map showed the vast distances of the Pacific Theater, the thousands of miles of ocean that separated Hawaii from Midway, Midway from Japan, Japan from the Philippines. So much water. So many places the Japanese could strike. And Rochefort had bet everything on one tiny atoll. "We stay the course," Rochefort said finally. "The water trap confirmed AF is Midway. Traffic analysis shows Japanese carriers moving toward the Central Pacific. The operational schedule might change by a day or 2, but the target is still Midway. I am certain of it." Dyer looked at him. "Are you certain? Or are you committed?" Rochefort turned from the map and met Dyer's eyes. "There is no difference anymore," he said. "I have bet 3,000 lives on my analysis. If I am wrong, certainty and commitment will not matter. We will all be dead or in prison." On May 30th, 1942, the USS Enterprise and USS Hornet departed Pearl Harbor and sailed northwest toward Midway. They were designated Task Force 16, under the command of Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Spruance was a cautious, methodical officer who preferred defensive tactics and carefully calculated risks. He had been given command of Task Force 16 only 2 weeks earlier, after Vice Admiral Halsey fell ill with a severe skin condition. Spruance had never commanded carriers in battle. He was a cruiser officer, suddenly responsible for the Navy's most valuable and vulnerable assets at the most critical moment of the war. The Enterprise and Hornet sailed in formation, their destroyer escorts screening them from submarines, their combat air patrols circling overhead, watching for Japanese scout planes. The seas were rough, the weather was cold and gray. The men aboard the ships knew they were sailing toward battle, but they did not know when or where or against what forces. The information was classified, restricted to senior officers who studied intelligence reports in sealed briefing rooms and made decisions that would determine whether the men lived or died. The next day, May 31st, the Yorktown departed Pearl Harbor and sailed to join Task Force 16. The repairs were incomplete. The welders had patched the bomb damage with steel plates, but the plates were not properly secured. The ship's engineers had restored power to damaged compartments, but the electrical systems were unstable. The Yorktown was seaworthy, barely, but she was not ready for combat. If she took serious damage in battle, she might sink. Lieutenant Junior Grade William Price stood on the Yorktown's flight deck as the ship cleared Pearl Harbor and watched Oahu disappear behind them. He thought about Sarah waiting for him at home, her belly just beginning to show the pregnancy. He thought about the letter he had written to her before departing, a letter that would be delivered only if he did not come back. In the letter, he had tried to explain why he had to go, why this battle mattered, why the intelligence he had helped develop was worth risking everything. But the words had felt hollow, even as he wrote them. How do you tell your pregnant wife that you might die because a 41-year-old cryptanalyst made a $5 bet? In Washington, Commander John Redmond sent yet another message to Admiral King, arguing that the Midway operation was a mistake. Redmond was convinced that Rochefort had misread the intelligence, that AF was not Midway, that the carriers were sailing into a trap. He demanded that King order Nimitz to recall the task forces before it was too late. King read Redmond's message and felt the weight of command pressing down on him. He was the chief of naval operations, responsible for the entire Navy, and he had to decide whether to trust intelligence from Pearl Harbor or intelligence from Washington. Both were based on the same intercepts. Both had skilled cryptanalysts. But they had reached opposite conclusions, and only one could be right. King drafted a message to Nimitz, questioning the intelligence and recommending extreme caution. But before he sent it, he did something unusual. He called Nimitz on the secure voice line and spoke to him directly. "Tell me honestly," King said, "do you trust Rochefort?" Nimitz paused before answering. "Rochefort is difficult," he said. "He is arrogant. He ignores protocol. He makes enemies. But he is also the best cryptanalyst I have ever seen. He broke the JN-25 code when everyone said it was impossible. He predicted the Coral Sea operation, and he has never been wrong about Japanese intentions. Not once. And if he is wrong this time," King asked, "then I will take full responsibility," Nimitz said. "But I believe he is right, and I believe if we do not fight this battle now, at Midway, on our terms, we will lose the war." King hung up the phone and tore up the message he had drafted. He would not second-guess Nimitz. He would not undermine Rochefort. He would let the operation proceed and pray that the intelligence was correct. On June 1st, 1942, Task Force 16 and the Yorktown rendezvoused at a position designated Point Luck, 350 miles northeast of Midway. The carriers steamed in formation, their crews at battle stations, their scouts flying search patterns looking for the Japanese fleet. The wait was agonizing. The men knew the Japanese were coming, but they did not know when or from what direction. They scanned the horizon for smoke or aircraft or any sign of the enemy. They found nothing but empty ocean. At Station Hypo, Rochefort was intercepting Japanese radio traffic that suggested the attack was imminent, possibly within 48 hours. But the intercepts were fragmentary. The code groups were partially unreadable. The timing was uncertain. Rochefort sent updated estimates to Nimitz every 6 hours, each one a best guess based on incomplete information, each one a gamble that thousands of lives depended on. On June 2nd, Rochefort intercepted a Japanese message that made his blood run cold. The message was addressed to units of the 1st Air Fleet, Admiral Nagumo's carrier strike force that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The message contained a series of code groups that Rochefort could not fully decode, but the context suggested that Nagumo had been ordered to execute the final phase of the operation. The attack was coming. Soon. Maybe within 24 hours. Rochefort called Nimitz and reported the intercept. Nimitz asked if Rochefort was certain the attack would be at Midway, and not somewhere else. Rochefort wanted to say yes. He wanted to be confident. But exhaustion and doubt had eroded his certainty. All he could say was, "As certain as I can be, sir," which is not the same as certain. Nimitz hung up and walked to the window of his office overlooking Pearl Harbor. He could see the salvage crews still working to raise sunken ships, still cleaning up the damage from December 7th. He thought about the 3 carriers sailing toward Midway, about the 3,000 men aboard them, about the decision he had made to trust Rochefort's intelligence. And he thought about what would happen if Rochefort was wrong. On the evening of June 2nd, Lieutenant Junior Grade William Price sat in the Yorktown's ready room, writing another letter to Sarah. He did not know if he would have time to finish it before battle. He did not know if he would survive to mail it. But he wrote anyway, trying to find words that would explain the fear and duty and hope that fought for space inside his chest. "The Japanese are coming," he wrote. "Commander Rochefort says they will attack Midway on June 4th or 5th. Everyone is betting their lives that he is right. I helped decode the messages that led to this conclusion. I looked at the same code groups Commander Rochefort looked at. I saw the same patterns, and I believed him when he said AF was Midway. I still believe him. But belief is not certainty. And if we are wrong, I will not come home to you." Price folded the letter and sealed it in an envelope addressed to Sarah. Then he lay down on his bunk and tried to sleep, knowing that in less than 48 hours he would learn whether Rochefort's $5 bet would save or destroy them all. The alarm sounded on the USS Yorktown at 5:34 in the morning on June 4th, 1942. Lieutenant Junior Grade William Price jerked awake in his bunk, his heart already pounding before his brain fully processed what was happening. Battle stations. The Japanese were coming. Price pulled on his uniform, grabbed his life jacket, and ran through the narrow passageways toward the Combat Information Center. where he had been assigned to monitor Japanese radio transmissions during the battle. The ship was alive with movement, hundreds of men rushing to their positions, preparing for combat. Price could hear the roar of aircraft engines on the flight deck above as pilots started their planes. He could feel the ship turning, picking up speed, positioning for the launch. In the Combat Information Center, Price put on his headphones and tuned his receiver to the Japanese frequencies that Station Hypo had identified as carrier command channels. Almost immediately, he heard Japanese voices speaking rapidly, issuing orders, coordinating the attack on Midway. The voices were calm, professional, confident. They did not know that American carriers were 300 miles away, waiting in ambush. Price thought about Commander Rochefort back at Pearl Harbor, listening to these same transmissions, and wondered if Rochefort was praying. Price was. He prayed that the intelligence was right. He prayed that Sarah would not become a widow. He prayed that his unborn child would have a father. At 6:02, a PBY Catalina patrol plane radioed an uncoded message that every ship in Task Force 16 and Task Force 17 could hear. Many planes heading Midway, bearing 320, distance 150. The Japanese carriers had been spotted. Rochefort had been right. AF was Midway. The trap was working. But Price felt no relief. Being right about where the Japanese would attack was only the first step. Now came the battle. Now came the part where thousands of men would die. At Station Hypo, Rochefort sat at his desk, listening to the same radio traffic Price was monitoring. He had not slept in 4 days. His eyes were bloodshot. His hands trembled from too much coffee and too many cigarettes. But he was alert, focused, listening to every word coming through the speakers, trying to extract information from the chaos of battle that might help the American commanders make better decisions. When he heard the PBY report confirming the Japanese carriers, Rochefort put his head in his hands and exhaled a breath he felt like he had been holding for a month. He had been right. The $5 bet had paid off. But he felt no triumph, only dread, because he knew what was coming next. The American torpedo bombers were about to fly into hell. The Douglas TBD Devastator was obsolete in 1942. It was too slow, too poorly armored, too vulnerable. Its Mark 13 torpedo had a failure rate above 60%, meaning even if a Devastator survived to drop its weapon, the torpedo would probably malfunction. But the Devastator was what the Navy had, and at 7:07 in the morning on June 4th, 41 Devastators launched from the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown and flew toward the Japanese carriers. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet. Waldron was 39 years old, part Sioux Indian, a man who had spent his entire adult life preparing for this moment. Before launching, he had written a final letter to his wife. He seemed to know he was not coming back. Waldron's squadron found the Japanese carriers first. 15 Devastators, flying low and slow, approaching the Japanese fleet without fighter escort because the Wildcats had gotten separated during the flight. The Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were steaming in formation, their decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled for a second strike. When the Devastators appeared on the horizon, the Japanese carriers launched their Zero fighters. What followed was slaughter. The Zeros dove on Waldron's squadron like hawks on field mice. The Devastators were so slow, the Zeros had to throttle back to avoid overshooting them. The Devastators had no defensive weapons that could protect them from fighters attacking from above and behind. One by one, they were shot down. Waldron was killed in the first minutes. His wingman burned and crashed into the ocean. The third plane exploded in midair. Of the 15 Devastators from Torpedo 8, 14 were destroyed before they could launch their torpedoes. The 15th, piloted by Ensign George Gay, managed to drop his torpedo, which missed before being shot down. Gay was the only survivor from the squadron. He spent the next 30 hours floating in the ocean, watching the battle, the sole witness to the annihilation of his unit. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise attacked next, 14 Devastators led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. They approached from a different angle, hoping to catch the Japanese carriers from 2 directions simultaneously. But the Zeros were waiting. Lindsay's plane was hit multiple times and crashed into the ocean. 10 of his 14 aircraft were destroyed. Not a single torpedo found its target. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown was the last to attack. 12 Devastators, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. They flew into the same wall of defensive fire that had destroyed the previous squadrons. Massey was killed. 10 of his 12 planes were shot down. The 2 survivors limped back to the Yorktown, so badly damaged they could barely fly. In less than 30 minutes, 35 out of 41 American torpedo bombers had been destroyed. 100 aircrewmen were dead or missing. Not a single torpedo had hit a Japanese ship. The Devastator attack had been a catastrophic failure. On the Yorktown, Lieutenant Junior Grade William Price listened to the radio transmissions from the torpedo bombers and heard men dying. He heard pilots calling for help that would not come. He heard gunners screaming as their planes burned. He heard the silence that followed when a plane went down and the radio cut off. Price took off his headphones and put his head down on the desk and tried not to vomit. He thought about Commander Rochefort. Was this Rochefort's fault? Had the intelligence been wrong? Had they sent these men to die based on a guess? No. The intelligence had been right. The Japanese were at Midway exactly where Rochefort had predicted. But being in the right place did not mean winning the battle. It just meant you got to die where you expected to die instead of somewhere else. At Station Hypo, Rochefort listened to the torpedo bomber attacks and felt each death like a physical blow. He knew some of these pilots. He had briefed them on Japanese carrier tactics. He had told them where to find the enemy. And now they were dead because they had believed him. Rochefort thought about Lieutenant Junior Grade William Price on the Yorktown, monitoring the battle, hearing his fellow aviators die. Price had a pregnant wife. Price had helped decode the messages that led to this battle. And if the battle was lost, if the carriers were sunk, Price would die, knowing that his own work had killed him. Rochefort lit another cigarette with shaking hands and tried to focus on the radio traffic. The battle was not over. The torpedo bombers had failed, but the dive bombers had not yet attacked. Everything still hung in the balance. And then, at 10:22 in the morning, everything changed. The Japanese carriers had spent the last 40 minutes recovering their Zero fighters, refueling and rearming their aircraft for a strike on the American carriers that had been spotted earlier. The flight decks of the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were crowded with planes, bombs, torpedoes, and fuel hoses. It was the worst possible moment to be attacked. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 33 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise. He had been searching for the Japanese carriers for over an hour, flying a grid pattern, burning fuel, wondering if he had missed them entirely. Then he spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northeast at maximum speed and realized it was heading back to the carrier fleet. McCluskey followed the destroyer's wake. At 10:22, McCluskey's dive bombers broke through the clouds 6,000 feet above the Japanese carriers and saw the target spread out below them like a gift from God. 3 carriers in a line. No fighter cover at altitude because all the Zeros were at low level where they had been chasing the torpedo bombers. The decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft ready to explode. McCluskey did not hesitate. He ordered the attack. The dauntless dive bombers rolled over and dove at 70-degree angles, screaming down at 250 miles per hour, aiming for the center of the flight decks. Japanese anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with black bursts of shrapnel. But the dive bombers were too fast, too steep, too focused. At 2,000 feet, they released their 1,000-pound bombs and pulled out of the dive so hard, the pilots grayed out from the G-forces. The first bomb hit the Akagi near the midship elevator. The explosion detonated torpedoes and bombs stacked on the deck, waiting to be loaded onto aircraft. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship. Fire spread across the flight deck and into the hangar below, where more armed aircraft were parked. Within minutes, the Akagi was an inferno. The second bomb hit the Kaga amidships, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the hangar. Fuel fires erupted. Ammunition cooked off. The blast killed dozens of crewmen and ignited a chain reaction of explosions that gutted the ship from the inside. The third bomb hit the Soryu near the forward elevator. The blast destroyed the flight deck, killed the bridge crew, and started fires that could not be controlled. The Soryu was doomed within 5 minutes of being hit. In less than 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier were destroyed. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted in the time it took to dive 6,000 feet. On the Yorktown, Price heard the dive bomber pilots reporting hits on the Japanese carriers and could not believe what he was hearing. After the torpedo bomber massacre, after watching 35 planes shot down without scoring a single hit, the dive bombers had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations. 3 carriers burning, the Japanese fleet in chaos, the battle turning in America's favor. Price pulled off his headphones and ran to the flight deck. He needed to see it with his own eyes. He needed to know it was real. When he reached the open air, he saw smoke rising on the western horizon, black columns visible even from 300 miles away. The Japanese carriers were burning. Price thought about the $5 bet Commander Rochefort had made. $5 that AF was midway. $5 that the Japanese could be ambushed. $5 that had just won the Battle of Midway and possibly saved the Pacific War. But the battle was not over. The 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, had not been hit. And at 10:55, the Hiryu launched a counterattack aimed directly at the Yorktown. Price was still on the flight deck when the alarm sounded. Incoming Japanese aircraft. He looked up and saw them diving out of the sun. 18 Aichi D-3A Valdive bombers coming straight down at the Yorktown. Price ran for cover as anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the sky with tracers and exploding shells. But the Japanese pilots were skilled and determined. They dove through the defensive fire and released their bombs. The first bomb hit near the island superstructure, penetrating the flight deck and exploding inside the ship. The blast killed dozens of men and knocked out several boilers. The second bomb hit amidships, starting fires. The third bomb went through the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, igniting parked aircraft. Price was thrown to the deck by the concussion. His ears rang. Smoke filled his lungs. He could not see. He could not breathe. He crawled toward what he thought was the edge of the flight deck, trying to escape the flames, and his hand touched something wet. He looked down and saw blood. A lot of blood. And then he saw the body. A sailor, maybe 20 years old, blown apart by the bomb blast. Price vomited. Then he stood up and kept moving, because staying still meant dying. The Yorktown was badly damaged but still afloat. Damage control teams fought the fires. The ship's list was corrected by counterflooding. Within 2 hours, the Yorktown was making 19 knots and recovering aircraft. She was wounded but still fighting. And then, at 2:45 in the afternoon, the Hiryu launched a second attack. 10 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, coming in low and fast, skimming the waves, aiming for the Yorktown's waterline. The Yorktown's escort destroyers tried to screen her, laying down smoke and firing every gun they had. But 2 of the Kate torpedo bombers got through. They dropped their torpedoes from less than 500 yards. Both torpedoes hit the Yorktown on the port side below the waterline. The explosions were massive. They ruptured fuel tanks, flooded compartments, knocked out the ship's electrical system. The Yorktown began to list heavily to port. Water poured in faster than the pumps could handle it. At 3 o'clock, the captain gave the order to abandon ship. The Yorktown was sinking. Lieutenant Junior Grade William Price stood on the tilting deck and looked at the water below. He thought about Sarah and the baby, and the letter he had written. He thought about Commander Rochefort listening to this battle from his basement in Pearl Harbor, hearing the Yorktown go down, knowing that one of his own men was on board. Lieutenant Junior Grade William Price floated in the Pacific Ocean for 4 hours before a destroyer picked him up. The water was cold. The sun was brutal. He could see the Yorktown listing heavily to port, her flight deck awash, men still jumping from her sides into the water. He could see destroyers circling, pulling survivors from the ocean, their decks crowded with exhausted sailors wrapped in blankets. He could hear men calling for help, their voices growing weaker as hypothermia and exhaustion took hold. When the destroyer USS Hammond finally hauled Price aboard, he collapsed on the deck and could not stand. A corpsman checked him for injuries and found none. No shrapnel wounds, no broken bones, just exhaustion and shock and the 1,000-yard stare that came from watching men die. The corpsman handed Price a cup of coffee and a blanket and told him to rest. Price sat on the deck with his back against a bulkhead and tried to process what had happened. The battle was over. The Japanese had lost 4 carriers. The Americans had lost 1, the Yorktown, which was still floating but would sink 2 days later, when a Japanese submarine found her and put 2 torpedoes into her damaged hull. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted. The war was far from over, but the turning point had been reached. America would win eventually. It was just a matter of time and blood. Price thought about Commander Rochefort and the $5 bet. Rochefort had been right. AF was midway. The intelligence had been perfect. The ambush had worked. And yet Price felt no triumph. He felt only exhaustion and grief and the weight of survival when so many others had died. At Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, Rochefort stood in his basement office, listening to radio reports from the battle zone. The Yorktown was sinking. Price was in the water. Rochefort did not know if Price had survived. He would not know for another 6 hours when casualty reports started coming in, and Price's name was listed among the rescued. When Rochefort finally learned that Price had survived, he sat down at his desk and put his head in his hands. He had sent Price to that battle. He had decoded the messages that led to that battle. And Price had almost died because of it. The fact that Price had survived did not erase the fact that 100 other men had not. Rochefort would carry those deaths for the rest of his life. But there was no time to grieve. The war continued. Station Hypo continued monitoring Japanese communications, tracking fleet movements, trying to stay ahead of enemy intentions. Rochefort and his team worked 20-hour shifts, sleeping on cots, surviving on coffee and cigarettes, doing the job that no one outside the basement understood or appreciated. And then, 3 weeks after the Battle of Midway, the Chicago Tribune published an article that would change everything. The article, published on June 7th, reported that the United States had known in advance about the Japanese plan to attack Midway because American cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese naval code. The article was written by a war correspondent who had been aboard one of the carriers during the battle and had overheard officers discussing the intelligence that had made the ambush possible. The article did not directly reveal classified information, but it came dangerously close. Anyone with knowledge of cryptanalysis who read the article would understand that American codebreakers were reading Japanese messages. The Japanese did read the article. Within days, they began changing their codes, adding new layers of encryption, rotating their cipher keys more frequently, tightening communication security. The window of intelligence that Station Hypo had worked so hard to open began to close. Not completely, not immediately, but enough to make a difference, enough to cost American lives in future battles. In Washington, Admiral Ernest King was furious. He demanded to know who had leaked the information to the Tribune. He wanted someone punished. He wanted someone held accountable. And the finger pointed directly at Joseph Rochefort. Commander John Redman, the head of OP-20G in Washington, sent a message to King's office suggesting that Rochefort had been careless with classified information, that Station Hypo's security protocols were inadequate, that Rochefort had allowed war correspondents access to intelligence materials. None of this was true. Rochefort had not leaked anything to the Tribune. He had not even spoken to the correspondent who wrote the article. But Redman saw an opportunity to undermine Rochefort, and he took it. The truth was that Redman had never forgiven Rochefort for being right about Midway. Redman had argued that AF was not Midway, that Rochefort's analysis was flawed, that the carriers should not be committed based on incomplete intelligence, and Rochefort had proven him wrong, publicly, decisively, humiliatingly. The Battle of Midway had been the greatest intelligence success in American naval history, and the credit belonged to Rochefort, not to Redman or OP-20G in Washington. Redman could not tolerate that. He was a career officer who measured success by rank and position and bureaucratic power. Rochefort was a maverick who wore carpet slippers to work and called admirals idiots and cared more about breaking codes than playing politics. The two men represented fundamentally different visions of how intelligence should work, and only one of them could survive. In July of 1942, Redman sent a message to Admiral Nimitz's chief of staff requesting that Rochefort be relieved of command at Station Hypo and transferred to Washington. The message claimed that Rochefort was uncooperative, that he refused to follow protocols established by OP-20G, that his methods were idiosyncratic and unreliable. Redman recommended that Rochefort be removed from cryptanalysis work entirely and given a less critical assignment. A few days later, Redman sent a second message, this time in a private cipher, to Commander Joseph Wenger, his deputy. The message was blunt: get rid of Rochefort at all costs. Nimitz read Redman's messages and was appalled. Rochefort had just delivered the most important intelligence victory of the war. He had been right when everyone in Washington had been wrong. He had saved the Pacific Fleet. And now Washington wanted to punish him for it? Nimitz wrote a letter to Admiral King recommending that Rochefort be awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for his work at Midway. Nimitz believed the recommendation was a formality. How could the Navy not recognize the man who had won the battle? Admiral King denied the recommendation. He did so on the advice of his staff, particularly Captain Russell Wilson, who had served with Rochefort years earlier and despised him. Wilson told King that Rochefort was difficult, insubordinate, and prone to exaggerating his own contributions. The Redman brothers, John and Joseph, both of whom held senior positions in Navy communications, reinforced this assessment. They told King that OP-20G in Washington had actually done the critical work on the Midway intelligence, and that Rochefort had simply implemented their analysis. This was a lie, but King believed it. In October of 1942, 4 months after the Battle of Midway, Joseph Rochefort was relieved of command at Station Hypo and ordered to report to Washington for reassignment. He was not given another intelligence posting. He was not promoted. He was not recognized for his contributions. Instead, he was given command of a floating dry dock at San Francisco, a meaningless administrative position designed to keep him out of the way. Rochefort walked out of the basement at Pearl Harbor for the last time on October 26th, carrying a cardboard box with his personal belongings, his smoking jacket, a Japanese dictionary, a photograph of his wife and daughter, the $5 bill he had won from Captain Layton after the water trap confirmed that AF was Midway. He did not say goodbye to his team. He did not make a speech. He simply walked out, got in a car, and left. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, who had worked with Rochefort since 1941, stood in the doorway and watched him go. "This is wrong," Dyer said to no one in particular. "He won the battle. He saved the fleet. And they are throwing him away like garbage." Ensign Joseph Finnegan, the Japanese linguist, shook his head. "Politics," he said. "Washington wanted control. Rochefort gave them victory instead. So they destroyed him." Lieutenant Junior Grade William Price, who had returned to Station Hypo after recovering from his ordeal at Midway, heard about Rochefort's reassignment and felt sick. He had survived the battle. He had been pulled from the ocean. He had written to Sarah and told her he was alive and would be coming home eventually. But Commander Rochefort, the man whose intelligence had made survival possible, was being punished for success. Price walked to Rochefort's empty office and stood in the doorway, looking at the bare desk, the empty ashtrays, the silence where Rochefort's voice had been. He thought about the $5 bet. He thought about the water trap. He thought about Rochefort sitting in this basement during the Battle of Midway, listening to men die, carrying the weight of every decision, every guess, every gamble. And he thought about what it meant that the Navy had decided to repay that burden with betrayal. Price pulled the letter he had written to Sarah from his pocket, the one he had written before the battle, the one that would have been delivered if he had died. He had kept it as a reminder of how close he had come to not coming home. He unfolded it and read the last paragraph. Commander Rochefort says the Japanese will attack Midway. Everyone is betting their lives that he is right. I helped decode the messages that led to this conclusion. I saw the same patterns. And I believed him. I still believe him. But belief is not certainty. And if we are wrong, I will not come home to you. They had not been wrong. Rochefort had been right, and Price had come home. But Rochefort would not be coming home to Station Hypo. He would spend the rest of the war commanding a floating dry dock, watching other men get credit for work he had done, carrying the knowledge that victory and betrayal were sometimes the same thing. In San Francisco, Rochefort reported to his new assignment and tried to make the best of it. He commanded the dry dock. He supervised repairs on damaged ships. He filed reports. He attended meetings. He did everything a good officer was supposed to do. But he was no longer doing the work he was born to do. He was no longer breaking codes, no longer outsmarting the enemy, no longer winning battles from a basement. He was just another officer counting the days until the war ended and he could retire. At night, alone in his quarters, Rochefort would take out the $5 bill he had won from Leighton and look at it. $5. The price of being right. The cost of proving Washington wrong. He wondered if it had been worth it. He wondered if he would do it again, knowing what it would cost him. The answer was always yes, because the alternative was letting 3,000 men sail to Midway without knowing the Japanese were coming. The alternative was another Pearl Harbor. The alternative was losing the war. And that was unacceptable, no matter what it cost him personally. But the bitterness remained. The knowledge that he had been punished for success, betrayed by the organization he had served faithfully, cast aside by men who were jealous of his achievements. Rochefort would carry that bitterness for the rest of his life. Lieutenant Junior Grade William Price was discharged from the Navy in 1945 after the war ended. He returned to his wife Sarah and his daughter, who had been born in December of 1942 while he was still at Station Hypo. He named her Josephine, after Joseph Rochefort, the man who had saved his life. Price never forgot what Rochefort had done. He never forgot the $5 bet, or the water trap, or the way Rochefort had sat in that basement during the Battle of Midway and carried the weight of 3,000 lives on his shoulders. And he never forgot that the Navy had repaid Rochefort's service with betrayal. In 1947, Price wrote a letter to Admiral Nimitz urging him to push for recognition of Rochefort's contributions. Nimitz wrote back saying he had tried, but that Washington had made its decision and would not reverse it. The letter ended with a line that Price would remember forever. Sometimes, Nimitz wrote, "The only reward for doing the right thing is knowing you did it." Commander Rochefort knows. That will have to be enough. But it was not enough. Not for Price. Not for the men who had served under Rochefort. Not for anyone who understood what had actually happened at Midway and what it had cost the man who made it possible. Joseph Rochefort retired from the Navy in 1947 without ever receiving the recognition he deserved. He moved to Torrance, California, and worked for a private company, living quietly, never talking about the war, never seeking publicity. He died in 1976 at the age of 76, still bitter about what had been done to him, still carrying the weight of a victory that had destroyed his career. It was not until 1986, 10 years after his death, that the Navy finally awarded Rochefort the Distinguished Service Medal that Nimitz had recommended in 1942. President Ronald Reagan presented the medal to Rochefort's family at a ceremony in Washington. The citation praised Rochefort for his extraordinary contributions to the victory at Midway and acknowledged that he had been unfairly treated by the Navy during the war. The medal came 44 years too late. But it came. And for the men who had served under Rochefort, who remembered the basement at Pearl Harbor, and the $5 bet, and the man in the smoking jacket, who had changed the course of history, the recognition mattered. It proved that sometimes, eventually, the truth wins, even if the man who deserved to see it does not live long enough to witness it. On May 30th, 1986, 44 years after the Battle of Midway, Joseph Rochefort's daughter Janet stood in the Roosevelt Room of the White House, holding a medal her father would never see. President Ronald Reagan was about to present her with the Distinguished Service Medal that Admiral Nimitz had recommended in 1942 and that the Navy had denied for reasons that had nothing to do with merit and everything to do with politics. Janet Rochefort was 63 years old. She had been a child during World War II, too young to understand what her father did or why he came home from work so exhausted he could barely speak. She remembered him sitting in his study late at night, smoking cigarettes, staring at nothing, carrying a burden she could not see. She remembered the day in October 1942 when he had come home early from Pearl Harbor, walked into the house without speaking, gone to his bedroom, and closed the door. Her mother had explained that Daddy had been given a new job in San Francisco, that they would be moving soon, that everything would be fine. But Janet had seen her mother crying that night, and she knew that everything was not fine. Now, 4 decades later, standing in the Roosevelt Room with her brother Joe beside her, Janet understood what had happened to her father. She understood that he had been punished for being right, betrayed by the organization he had served, cast aside by men who valued politics over competence. And she understood that this medal, delivered decades too late, was an admission of guilt disguised as an honor. President Reagan stood before the small gathering of family members, Navy officials, and journalists. He held the medal in its presentation case and began to read the citation. For exceptionally meritorious service to the government of the United States, in a duty of great responsibility, as officer in charge of the Combat Intelligence Unit, United States Pacific Fleet, from June 1941 to November 1942. Through his capable leadership and brilliant analysis of enemy radio communications, Commander Rochefort provided intelligence which contributed significantly to the victory of American forces at the Battle of Midway. Reagan looked up from the citation and spoke directly to Janet and Joe. "Your father was a hero," he said. "Not the kind of hero who carries a rifle or flies a plane, but the kind who wins battles with his mind. He saw patterns where others saw chaos. He made guesses that turned out to be certainties. And he saved thousands of American lives by being smarter than the enemy. The Navy was wrong to deny him this medal in 1942. We cannot change the past, but we can acknowledge the truth. Your father deserved this honor then, and he deserves it now." Janet accepted the medal. She shook the president's hand. She smiled for the photographers. But inside, she felt only sadness. Her father had died 10 years earlier, in July 1976, without ever receiving the recognition he had earned. He had lived the last 34 years of his life knowing he had been betrayed, carrying that bitterness like a stone in his chest. And now, a decade after his death, the Navy finally admitted what everyone who knew the truth had known all along. Joseph Rochefort had won the Battle of Midway, and the Navy had destroyed him for it. After the ceremony, Vice President George Bush, who had himself been a Navy pilot during World War II, approached Janet and spoke to her privately. "I knew your father," Bush said. "Not well, but I knew him. And I want you to know that there were men in the Navy who never forgot what he did. Men who tried to get him recognized. Men who were appalled by what Washington did to him. It took too long, but we never stopped trying." Janet thanked him. Then she and her brother left the White House and walked out into the Washington sunshine, carrying the medal that had arrived 44 years too late. In Torrance, California, where Joseph Rochefort had lived after retiring from the Navy, there was a small house on a quiet street where he had spent his final years working for a private company and trying to forget the war. He had never talked about Midway. He had never sought publicity. He had never told his children what he had done in that basement at Pearl Harbor, or how he had changed the course of history. He had kept it all inside, buried beneath layers of bitterness and resignation, carrying the knowledge that the only reward for doing the right thing was knowing you had done it. But others had not forgotten. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, who had worked under Rochefort at Station Hypo, had spent decades trying to get his former commander the recognition he deserved. Dyer had written letters to admirals, to congressmen, to anyone who would listen. He had testified before Navy boards reviewing the case. He had provided documentation proving that Rochefort, not OP-20G in Washington, had been responsible for the Midway intelligence. And he had never given up, even when it seemed hopeless. In 1981, another former subordinate, Captain Donald Showers, who had gone on to become a high-level official in the Central Intelligence Agency, had made one final push to get Rochefort's Distinguished Service Medal approved. Showers had connections in Washington that Dyer lacked. He knew how to navigate the bureaucracy. He knew which levers to pull and which arguments would work. And in 1985, 5 years after Showers started his campaign, the Navy finally agreed to review Rochefort's case. The review took months. Files had to be located. Witnesses had to be interviewed. The historical record had to be examined. And slowly, reluctantly, the Navy came to the conclusion it should have reached in 1942. Joseph Rochefort had been right. The intelligence that won the Battle of Midway had come from Station Hypo, not from Washington. And Rochefort had been punished not for failure, but for success. The approval for the posthumous medal came through in late 1985. President Reagan personally agreed to present it to Rochefort's family in a White House ceremony. And on May 30th, 1986, 44 years and 1 day after the Battle of Midway began, the medal was finally awarded. But Joseph Rochefort never knew. He had died 10 years earlier, still bitter, still carrying the weight of betrayal, still wondering if the $5 bet had been worth the cost. Lieutenant Junior Grade William Price, who had survived the sinking of the Yorktown and returned home to his wife Sarah and their daughter Josephine, lived long enough to see Rochefort finally receive recognition. Price was 67 years old in 1986. retired from a career in engineering, living in San Diego with Sarah, their daughter grown and married with children of her own. When Price read in the newspaper that President Reagan had presented Rochefort's family with the Distinguished Service Medal, he sat down at his kitchen table and cried. He cried for the man who had saved his life. He cried for the injustice that had taken 44 years to correct. And he cried because Rochefort had not lived to see it. Price pulled out a cardboard box from his closet, a box he had kept for 44 years, a box containing letters and photographs and mementos from the war. At the bottom of the box was the letter he had written to Sarah before the Battle of Midway, the letter that would have been delivered if he had died. He unfolded it and read it one more time. Commander Rochefort says the Japanese will attack Midway. Everyone is betting their lives that he is right. I helped decode the messages that led to this conclusion. I believed him. I still believe him. Price refolded the letter and put it back in the box. Then he took out a pen and paper and wrote a letter to Janet Rochefort, whom he had never met. He introduced himself. He explained that he had served under her father at Station Hypo. He told her about the Battle of Midway, about floating in the ocean waiting to be rescued, about naming his daughter after her father, and he told her what he wished he could have told Joseph Rochefort before he died. Your father saved my life, Price wrote. Not directly. I never flew a plane, or fired a gun, or did anything heroic. But I was on the Yorktown when she was sunk, and I survived because Commander Rochefort put us in the right place at the right time. He was right when everyone else was wrong. He bet everything on his analysis, and he won. And then the Navy destroyed him for it. I have carried that knowledge for 44 years. I have never forgotten what he did, and I want you to know that there are men like me all over this country, men who owe their lives to your father's intelligence and courage. We never forgot him. We never will. Price mailed the letter. 2 weeks later, he received a reply from Janet Rochefort, thanking him for his words and telling him that her father would have appreciated knowing that the men who served under him remembered him. The letter included a photograph taken at the White House ceremony, showing Janet holding the medal. Price framed the photograph and hung it on his wall next to a picture of the Yorktown. The $5 bill that Joseph Rochefort had won from Captain Layton after the water trap confirmed that AF was Midway had been kept by Rochefort for the rest of his life. He had carried it in his wallet through the war, through his exile to San Francisco, through his retirement. When he died in 1976, the bill was found among his personal effects. His family did not know what it meant. It was just a $5 bill, old and worn, with a note attached, saying, May 8, 1942. Janet Rochefort brought the $5 bill to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington after the medal ceremony. She donated it to the National Museum of American History, along with her father's Distinguished Service Medal and a collection of documents related to the Battle of Midway. The curators placed the $5 bill in a display case with a placard explaining its significance. This $5 bill represents the bet Commander Joseph Rochefort made with Captain Edwin Layton on May 8, 1942, that he could prove the Japanese target designated AF was Midway Atoll. Rochefort won the bet. His intelligence led to the American victory at Midway and changed the course of the Pacific War. Visitors to the museum can still see that $5 bill today. It sits in a climate-controlled case next to artifacts from the Battle of Midway, photographs of the burning Japanese carriers, a piece of metal from the Yorktown, a flight jacket worn by a dive bomber pilot, and the $5 bill that started it all. The legacy of Joseph Rochefort extends far beyond that medal and that $5 bill. His methods, his approach to intelligence analysis, his insistence on combining signals intelligence with operational understanding became the foundation of American cryptanalysis for decades. The National Security Agency, created in 1952, traces its intellectual lineage directly to the work done at Station Hypo. Modern intelligence professionals study Rochefort's analysis of the Midway intercepts as a case study in how to make critical decisions based on incomplete information. But more than that, Rochefort's story became a cautionary tale about how organizations treat their best people, about how politics can destroy competence, about how jealousy and bureaucratic infighting can punish success, about how the men who win battles are not always the men who get the medals. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who had recommended Rochefort for the Distinguished Service Medal in 1942, and who had watched Washington reject that recommendation, never forgot what had been done to his intelligence officer. In 1966, 10 years before Rochefort's death, Nimitz wrote a letter to the Naval War College about the Battle of Midway. The victory at Midway was a victory of intelligence, Nimitz wrote. Without the brilliance of Commander Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo, we would have lost the battle, and possibly the war. History should remember that. And history should remember what we did to the man who made it possible. That letter, written by one of the greatest admirals in American history, sat in Navy files for 2 decades before it was finally used as evidence in the campaign to get Rochefort his medal. Nimitz died in 1966, never living to see his recommendation finally approved. But his words helped convince the Navy that justice, even delayed by 44 years, was still worth pursuing. Today, there is a memorial to Joseph Rochefort at the Admiral Nimitz Museum in Fredericksburg, Texas. The memorial includes a bronze plaque with his photograph and a description of his contributions to the Battle of Midway. Every year on June 4th, the anniversary of the battle, veterans and their families gather at the memorial to remember the men who fought at Midway and the intelligence officers who made victory possible. And every year someone places a $5 bill at the base of the memorial. No one knows who does it. No one has ever claimed credit. But every June 4th the bill appears, a reminder of the bet Joseph Rochefort made, the battle he won, and the price he paid for being right.